Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm going to be looking at the new album from Paul Hartnoll of Orbital, 858. Now, I realize I said I was going back to throwback reviews, but I just found out today that this album finally got released in the US iTunes store. I have no idea how long it's been there, but it's about time. This album's been out since March, and the CD for this album got shipped to me all the way back in April, but of course, at the time I wasn't sure if I was ready to do this whole review show thing. Now I've had plenty of time to digest this project, and I have quite a bit to say about it. Anyway, let's get down to business. Paul Hartnoll is a former member of the two-man band Orbital, the other member being his brother, Phil Hartnoll. From what I can gather, they broke up because they felt that their music was getting stale and that they needed to move on to other projects, but I digress. Anyway, if you follow me on Twitter or known me personally for a long enough time, you'd probably know that, to say the least, I'm a big fan of Orbital. Ordinarily, this would be the part where I go down all the Orbital albums and do my In Brief segment, but I'm not gonna do that for a few reasons. For one thing, this isn't Orbital, it's an entirely different solo project from Paul Hartnoll. For another thing, I don't think I could do Orbital justice by just speaking for a few seconds on each album. Orbital has consistently been my favorite band pretty much since my uncle first showed them to me when I was in 5th grade. They were my introduction to the world of electronic music. Though my love for their music is partially due to nostalgia from the days when I was first getting into the genre, they've continued to hold that #1 spot for all these years for just how much they continue to impress me with repeated listens. They brought me in with their great melodies and beats and impressive extended pieces. That was back in the day when I thought a song being 10 minutes long was absolutely crazy. And they brought me back with their amazing attention to detail. I currently own CDs of all their albums, film soundtracks, and solo projects. Alright, so now that we got the pointless fanboying out of the way, let's talk about this latest project. So the idea behind 858 is that we are currently living under the regime of a supreme dictator who controls every aspect of our lives. We constantly live by the dictator's rules, we obey happily, even admiring the dictator's presence in our lives. Who is this dictator, you might ask? None other than time itself. And this album is a moment in which you, the listener, are to break free of time's tyranny, as it were. Paul has also commented about the meaning of 858 as a moment where you decide that you're going to break your routine and get done what you want to get done. He mentioned in some interview, I can't remember where, that the formation of Orbital in itself was an 858 moment, and that he decided in an instant, 2 minutes before he was supposed to go to work, that he wanted to turn music into a full-time career. It's an interesting and thought-provoking concept, to be sure, and one that's very personal to him. So, how does it turn out? Well, it's no surprise to find out that it turned out brilliantly. The album feels like the result of what would have happened if Paul's earlier solo project, The Ideal Condition, were put together and composed in the same way as an ordinary Orbital album. The Ideal Condition was an almost entirely acoustic album that involved live orchestra in many tracks, and to be completely honest, that project wasn't fantastic. My biggest problem was that aside from maybe 1 or 2 tracks, it sounded absolutely nothing like Orbital. It was still very enjoyable, mind you, but I felt like I was listening to a completely different person. 858 at first seems to be cut from the same cloth as more recent Orbital projects like Wonky, but upon closer examination, I'm finding a lot of similarities with The Ideal Condition as well. And not just because the album happens to contain a remix of a song from that album. Sure, the album is entirely electronic, but those folk music influences have bled through, mainly thanks to the myriad of vocal guests, most of which are rarely found in the electronic music world. Lisa Knapp, The Unthanks, Ed Harcourt, Leanne Hall, even Robert Smith of The Cure. Anyways, I was saying, despite all the similarities to The Ideal Condition, the album still keeps up the spirit of Orbital. For instance, the title track and opener. This song begins with a narration from Cillian Murphy explaining the concept of the album, before we hear some chime sounds, and it turns into a bright, hopeful, brilliant tune, and then slowly evolving into a darker and more percussive sound. This kind of track that starts out in one place and ends up somewhere entirely different It's one of the things I love about Orbital songs. Next up is the Please remix. I was wondering if a rehash of an old track would really work, and quite frankly I expected the worst. But I think this remix is actually better than the original, employing a much more electronic and Orbital-esque sound. In addition, the song actually does tie into the album's concept quite well, thanks to lyrics like really sold on a routine, really stuck, really fixed on the 3 to 3. Still not the best version I've heard of this track. That honor goes to the KCB mix, but it's definitely a step up from the original. Next up is The Past Now, and this is our typical indecipherable female singer track that we usually get out of Orbital albums. What's interesting is that the vocals on this track are actually sampled from a different Lisa Knapp song called Ruler of the Rest. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the original version to hear exactly what she is saying, but what's really strange about this track is that it's the only one in which I couldn't understand what the singer was saying. I mean, I'm used to stuff like this out of Orbital. But I could actually decipher the lyrics on most of these songs. Anyway, next is Villain. That's kind of more along the lines of the Ideal Condition kind of stuff. It has kind of a more folkish sound with a singer that kind of whispers in some parts and can be kind of hard to hear. But my god, is this song an earworm. Whenever I listen to this song out of context, it gets stuck in my head and never leaves. But in a good way. The album then hits its centerpiece, as it were, in The Clock. This track is very bombastic and hard-hitting, featuring the same Cillian Murphy monologue from the title track. This track admittedly doesn't have a lot to it, and at only about 3 minutes, it's unreasonably short. But at the same time, I keep feeling obliged to listen to it over and over and over. There's just something addicting about the song, something about that raw energy contained within. But after this loud and bombastic number, we get A Forest, which is almost the exact opposite, very slow, mysterious sounding. This song is a cover of the song by The Cure, and is an interesting contrast to the original. The original was a fairly typical of the time 80s synth-pop rock tune, but by the time Paul's gotten his hands on it, it's turned into something completely different, and one that actually fits the song lyrics much better than the original did, really sounding like you're lost in a forest or something. Also, the song actually fits into the concept rather well thanks to The Clock. If The Clock is about rebelling against time, then A Forest is about seeing the consequences of your actions and finding that you may have made a mistake, finding that you're completely lost without it. But what I love most about this track is the ending. While the unthanks are singing again and again and again and again, we have this amazing, epic, slow burn rock build-up. Love this track. The song then flows into the laid-back and contemplative instrumental Broken Up. I'd express more love for this track if it weren't for the fact that Paul immediately tops it with Nearly There, an intense, fast-paced, adrenaline-pumping instrumental that actually reminds me of a certain deadmau5 song. Probably a coincidence, but you know what? I think I like this better than 8-Bit. It's much more full-sounding and detailed, and of course is the most Orbital-sounding track out of all the songs in this album. Sounding like something out of, like, the middle of nowhere. Finally, we close off with Cemetery, which as far as I can tell has absolutely nothing to do with a cemetery. This is like the Halcyon equivalent of the album, although unlike previous Halcyon Spawn tracks like The Girl with the Sun in Her Head or One Perfect Sunrise, the lyrics are clearly understandable. The lyrics seem to be about being stuck in some repeating pattern, or as singer Fable puts it, tessellation, and wanting to go beyond the barriers of your mind, which seems to fit the concept and actually mirrors Please pretty well. Also, the song is unbelievably catchy, and actually gets pretty interesting at the end with this cool build-up. However, my biggest problem with this album as a whole comes up in literally the last second of the album. Cillian Murphy cuts off the build-up saying, "Time's up." And the album just abruptly ends there. Right when I was really getting into the track, no less. As usual, it got less irritating the more I listened to the album, and could see it coming, but I felt like Cemetery could have gone off on some wild tangent like a real Orbital track would have, if it were not for that infuriating ending cutting it off before it had the chance to live out its full potential. And this directly leads me to my biggest complaint with this album as a whole. It's too short! Clocking in at just under 49 minutes. This is shorter than any album released under the Orbital name. Even if you count solo projects, only The Ideal Condition is shorter. Both these albums suffer a similar problem in that, while the music contained within is brilliant, it feels like he could have fleshed everything out more and made it longer. Orbital was always about making big, long things in their prime, and now it almost feels like Paul's kinda scared to go over the top again. There used to be a time when they can put out things like the original version of The Box, which was this 4-movement prog rock influenced suite that stretched on for nearly a half hour. That's just one song, by the way. I didn't see this problem in Phil's work with Long Range, so I've concluded this is just a weakness of Paul's that Phil held up in their main albums. That being said, for all my complaints and hungering for more, I was more than satisfied with 8:58, and its short running time only convinced me to listen to it more and more. It's a huge step up from The Ideal Condition in my opinion, which felt like a once-off experiment for Paul. This, on the other hand, feels much more involved, and the concept tying everything together is a wonderful touch. I'm still of the opinion that the brothers are stronger together than they are by themselves, but this is easily the project I've listened to the most this year, so thank you, Paul, for giving us this, and I still got my fingers crossed for another Orbital reunion. Could still happen, you know? Overall, feeling a 8.5 out of 10. Or maybe an 8.58 out of 10. Favorite tracks, 8:58, The Past Now, Villain, The Clock, A Forest, Nearly There, Cemetery. Least favorite track, Please Remix, but even that one's pretty good. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel to agree or disagree with me, but if you do, make sure to tell me in the comments. Or if you have any requests for what I should review in the future, tell me about that as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.